So, a resolution by Ghana at the United Nations condemning the transatlantic slave trade was passed unanimously on, well, today's date at the making of this video, March 25, 2026. And this resolution called for the condemning of the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, and many of us welcome this. This is a step in the right direction, condemning the transatlantic slave trade. We are calling it the greatest crime against humanity, which lasted for hundreds of years. The reason people like me, African, those who ascend from Africans who were enslaved or in this region because of the, yes, transatlantic slave trade. And there's a lot of disinformation, a lot of lies put out how the slave trade happened to begin with. But this resolution was passed unanimously by members vote. It was 123 countries voted in favor or in support of this resolution. Some 52 abstained, and 3 countries, I don't even want to mention them, 3 countries voted against. So you can take a look at that. You can see the result and what those countries probably represent to vote against a motion like this or some resolution like this. But some of the things that this resolution demanded is reparative justice. So reparation. So a reparation for the victim of the transatlantic slave trade. And if you guys don't know, slave owners, those who own the plantation, those who own human beings as cattle, as animals, actually receive reparation, believe it or not. A case in Jamaica, a famous British Prime Minister came from a family who actually received reparation. And up until recently, a lot of families, a lot of businesses were receiving reparation from the transatlantic slave trade, or from the losing of their slave labor, free labor, from Jamaica. Many banks and so forth were being paid reparation, but the victim of the slave trade never received any reparative justice, no reparation. And this resolution actually called this a aggravated human rights violation. Of course it is, to subject a whole group of people or a race of people to slavery, to work for free for hundreds of years. It's inhumane. And these people have never apologized. They have never paid reparation, as I said before. And we hope that we get into this. But I want to say a bit more about reparation and how it's being pushed. It seems as if those who are actually, Africa is the victim of reparation, of course, but people in the Caribbean and in the Americas who bore the brunt of slavery in this region seems to have a lower voice, seem to speak lower. And of course, we admire the authority in Barbados. They've been pushing this thing for a while now. Countries like Jamaica, they haven't been saying anything, but there's a tactic being used to basically co-opt this push for reparation. And you see it being used by these pseudo-intellectuals, especially in the Caribbean. And I'm a bit worried for those who are actually pushing this thing. The people themselves are not educated on the need for reparation and the importance of reparation. People in the Caribbean especially, but also in Africa. Most African countries don't know one iota about slavery, even colonization. They don't know that people like us, whether you find us in Jamaica, whether you find us in Cuba, in Haiti, we were actually ripped away from the motherland. We weren't ripped from Ghana, we weren't ripped from Nigeria because these places, these countries did not exist. We were ripped from Africa. So most Africans on the continent does not know about the slave trade, and actually they're not taught the they're not taught the history of the slave trade. And I think there's something very devious being put out there, where the idea that Africans were the ones who started the slave trade. To where? Where were they slave? To where? To whom were they trading before before the Europeans came and started kidnapping Africans and taking them? And we have to put it out there, the truth and true history, that the slave trade did not start like that. Things like this happen when society collapsed. And how did these societies collapse? Because Africa had organized society. We talk about the Benin Kingdom and so forth. This happened because of course, invasion. What happened was a invasion of these societies, whether you call them kingdoms or so forth. These were invasion. These are the authority or the ruling class was changed, just like what we see a lot of nations are doing today. You destroy a country, you destroy a nation, then all kind of cynicism, all kinds of evil, and then you, the invader and the oppressor, can do what you want and then blame the people when you're the one who is enabling this and benefiting from that, because Africa did not benefit from slave trade one bit. There's not one African country that can say, we built this from the slave trade. And a lot of people like to say, especially in the diaspora, we like to say, oh, no African countries reach out for their lost people, those who were sent back here. But we have to understand the slave trade went on for hundreds of years. And during the period we had colonization, we had multiple kingdoms and nations destroyed. And these African countries were only created in the 1950s and 60s. So and they're under neo-colonization. And if a government tried to take a path of true independence, then the country is overthrown or destroyed. So those who are saying that they were abandoned by brothers and sisters on the continent, we have to understand the politics and the geopolitics and it's our own history, and which is tied to what has happened in the continent, not just since this flag independence, but further down, 400 years ago. We haven't had an independent Africa or African nation since 500, 400 years ago. So this resolution is a good step in the right direction, mainly towards African countries. You can see there's a awakening, not just African countries, but countries in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, even here in North America, in the United States, where this push for reparation or this idea of being compensated, even though I don't believe you can actually pay enough for reparation, and how that reparation might look, it has to be discussed with the population, especially those who have suffered the most. It's not just giving people money, but it has to be, we've lost a lot. And of course, some of the resolution is calling for the respect of African countries. This idea that African countries are independent is of course false. We're in the neo-colonial stage. So therefore, the respect of African countries, I believe that it's good that they're calling for that, but we know, and then this is what I worry about. This thing is being pushed by individual government. It doesn't seem like it is a pan-African movement. You can call for respect, but you're still a small nation that is under neo-colonial domination. You're calling for respect for African nation to give you sovereignty and so forth, but we've seen the world we live in, that there are people who actually make laws and decide to break the laws because they think they're big and they have the biggest weapons. So how about we call for the unity of these African countries and African nations with the Caribbean as well, whether it's politically, economically, socially, of course, and culturally. We can express ourselves in our true self, I would say. But with all with all that is said and done, we're asking the Ghanaian government, you've sponsored this resolution. That is good, and we admire, we appreciate you speaking out on behalf of those who have bear the brunt of slavery, bear the brunt of the transatlantic slave trade. But will the Ghanaian government teach this history in school? Because you've met a lot of people in Ghana, they don't understand the slave trade and how it's effect. The foreign minister, and we greet him in passing, spoke about even the the genetical fallout from the bad diet that we received for over 400 years on these plantations where we were just fed. A perfect example is just salt and carbohydrates and sugar, raw sugar that is, fed just for you to work as much as possible in a short amount of time. Some chronic disease have become almost in your gene. For example, we have a higher risk of diabetes, high blood pressure, because of the diet we were fed. Not only that, the trauma. Some things like something as simple, well, not as simple, but something like anxiety. A lot of people, especially in the Caribbean, we walk around with just anxiety, and we don't know where this comes from. This is from the trauma of slavery. That is just the tip of the iceberg. Psychological issues. Many of us, we are probably prone to certain psychological issues. It doesn't have to be something that you will, maybe something like hunger. It depends. A lot of psychological issues have been passed down through that trauma for generations. So when we talk about reparation, these things has to address in order to mitigate these effects and also try to reverse a lot of these things. Our diet, our food, some of the food we eat, we think it's nice. But this is what our ancestors were fed, and they had short life expectancy, all because the food they were fed. That is the reason why some of us are prone to like high blood pressure. There's not a person in the Caribbean, especially let's give Jamaica for example. They're saying about like 25,000 people have diabetes, is walking around with diabetes, and that is the proven number, because growing up we see a lot of people diagnosed with these chronic diseases, and they had it for a while, but they didn't have such access to healthcare and all those things. These are things that we have to discuss when it comes to reparation. But ladies and gentlemen, this is something very close, dear to us in the diaspora, and we hope that Mahama, well, not Mahama himself, but the Ghanaian government would teach this lesson in schools. Teach this lesson in your primary school, in your universities, because the solution actually lies in Africa itself. We come from Africa, so the solution lies, especially in our diet. We can tweak our diet because we can go back to indigenous food in a sense that will fix a lot of these issues. And also our culture. We need to go back to adapt a lot of our culture, because culture drive even your diet. Culture drive your mood. Culture can drive your mental state of mind. So we hope to see more collaboration with the diaspora and so forth. But we think this is a good step, and we admire this by the Ghanaian government. They're brave enough to take this on. And Ghana needs to be the voice of a lot of Africans in the diaspora as well, because a lot of our countries are very small, and even though there's huge African population, black population in the Americas, many of those big populations are not sovereign states, are not nation state, as you would put it. For example, in Brazil, you have a huge African population, yet still their voice is mute or low. They cannot speak on behalf of themselves. There's no, they are not representative. There's no representative at the UN that can speak on behalf of them. So we need more people, more countries in the African continent, and Nigeria should be doing a role like this, the so-called giant of Africa. But that's another story for that's a story for another day. And I want to thank the people of Ghana, especially because Ghana have really stepped up. The hurricane in Jamaica, Ghana sent not only aid, but it's personally sent bodies, physical able bodies to help out in Jamaica. And you know, Ghana has to, I wish Ghana would take more role in the Caribbean, especially like Haiti. Maybe there's a solution from Ghana to the issue in Haiti, especially the political side of it. Thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll see you in the next one.